When I was 12, I thought life was like an endless sunny day. We lived in a small town in Indiana, the kind where people knew each other by name and news traveled faster than the chimes of a church tower. Our house stood on a quiet street with broad, winged maples whose branches formed cool arches over the sidewalks on hot days. It seemed to me that nothing bad could possibly happen in this idyll. My world was the backyard, where I spent more time than anywhere else. My father built a wooden treehouse that became my refuge from everything. I would sit there for hours, looking at an old map of the world that my grandmother had brought back from a trip to Europe. I had a small telescope and dreamed of becoming an astronomer. At night, I would look out for planets, sometimes even waking up right there, covered with a blanket. That year, everything began to change a little. My mother said that life flows like a river. You can't stop it. But I didn't understand what it meant then. My father had lost his job at the factory where he had worked for 15 years. At first he said it was temporary and that he would soon find something new. But as the weeks turned into months, the atmosphere in the house became increasingly tense. We no longer went on picnics, and the evenings when the family gathered around the TV to watch old movies ceased to exist. I tried to ignore what was happening. It was a particularly hot summer, and I spent my days with my best friend Ben. He had an old bicycle that we would ride until sunset, exploring the surrounding area. Ben was an energetic guy and was always coming up with something new. Building a raft, exploring an abandoned house, or digging an underground tunnel in the backyard. His endless ideas distracted me from what was happening at home. One of those days, we found an old barn on the outskirts of town. It was almost in disrepair, with rotten boards and a roof that was broken in several places. Ben and I decided that this was our new, secret place. It was filled with old junk, toolboxes, a broken bike, even a giant chair with peeling paint. We pretended it was our headquarters, spending hours there, making things out of old boards. But one of those summer adventures was the beginning of a change for me that I could not have foreseen. One day, while Ben and I were rummaging through one of the boxes in the shed, I found a photograph. It was an old black and white card with a picture of two people, a man with rugged features and a woman with a warm smile. On the back was written, Helen and George, 1952. It seemed like an ordinary find, but my insides turned upside down. It was my father, only younger. I didn't say anything to Ben and put the photo in my pocket. All evening I thought about why it would be in such a place. Maybe my father had something to do with the barn? Maybe this place had some significance to our family? Questions filled my head. I decided that I would show the photo to my mother. I didn't know what would happen next. But until then I was just a boy holding a small piece of the past in his hands and trying to figure out what to do with it. The photo burned into me from the inside. I walked around the next day as if I was lost, mentally turning it over and over in my head. Who was Helen? And why was my father in the photo with her? I couldn't stop thinking that this old barn was somehow connected to him. But what bothered me most was why he never talked about it. A couple of times during dinner I wanted to ask him directly, but my father's eyes, tense and thoughtful, seemed to warn, "Don't touch on this topic." My mother looked tired that evening. She tried to pretend everything was normal, but even 12-year-old me could feel how normal was cracking at the seams. My father barely spoke, only throwing out a few short phrases about having to call something at work. Normally I would have run off to my tree or to Ben's, but that night I decided to stay home. After dinner was over and my father had gone to the garage, I plucked up my courage and went up to my mother. I took the photograph out of my pocket and put it in front of her. She glanced at the card, and I saw her face turn pale. Her lips twitched, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. "Where did you get this?" she finally said. I told her about the barn and how we found the picture. She looked at it for a long time, as if it would answer all her questions. Then she said, "It's a long story, Jack. I don't think you need to worry about it." But how could I not? I saw her hands shaking as she put the photograph in the drawer. I had no choice but to go to my room. But instead of calming down, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of foggy past was hidden behind this black and white photo. The next day, I decided to take action. While my parents were busy with their own affairs, I went to the barn alone. Ben invited me to ride my bike, but I said that I had things to do. The barn seemed strangely quiet and even ominous. It seemed as if it was waiting for me. I felt like a real detective. Everything around me breathed mystery. I began to look around the place, hoping to find something else that could shed light on the history of this photograph. Most of the things were just a pile of rubbish, but in the corner I noticed an old wooden box with rusty hinges. Opening it with difficulty, I found a stack of letters inside, tied with a frayed ribbon. The paper was yellowed and the ink was faded in places, but each envelope bore the name Helen Rivers. At that moment, I felt my insides clench. It was her, the woman in the photograph. I carefully untied the ribbon and pulled out the first letter. It was addressed, "Dear George," and signed, "Love, Helen." I didn't know if I should continue reading, but my curiosity got the better of me. The letters talked about a place called the Cliffs. Helen wrote that she missed George and hoped that they would meet there again, like before. She mentioned their walks, songs by the fire, and the stars that, in her words, looked only at the two of them. Each letter was tender and sometimes sad, as if she were afraid that their story was about to end. I had only read halfway through when I heard someone calling my name. It was Ben. I quickly put the letters back in the drawer and closed it, as if I was afraid that someone would guess about my discovery. Ben came up to me, smiling, and asked why I was alone. I just shrugged and said I was looking for something interesting. He, of course, didn't ask any unnecessary questions and suggested going to the park. But I kept thinking about the letters. That evening I tried to talk to my mother again. This time I asked her about the cliffs. She froze in place, as if I had touched something painful. "How do you know that?" she asked, and there was fear in her voice. I lied and said that I had read it in a book. She just shook her head and said, "It's all long gone, Jack. Sometimes it's better not to stir up the past." But how could I stop when I felt like I was standing on the threshold of something big, something connected with my father, with his youth, with his life before us? Maybe this would explain why he had become so distant, why in recent months the house did not seem as cozy as before. I had to figure all this out. I returned to the barn the next day and took some of the letters with me. As I read them, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. It turned out that my father had been in love with Helen before he met my mother. They had spent their summers together at the Cliffs, someplace I knew nothing about. But then something happened that Helen hadn't written about directly. In one of her letters, she mentioned those events that had separated them. What could that have been? By then, I knew one thing. I had to find that place. The Cliffs wasn't just a name. It was the key to understanding what my father was hiding. And I couldn't wait any longer. The idea of finding the cliffs was stuck in my head. I couldn't just forget it even if I wanted to. Everything around me seemed like a mystery. At breakfast, I tried to act like a normal boy nibbling on cereal, but inside I was impatient. I was thinking about how to find this place without asking my parents directly. Any mention of the cliffs caused my mother to react strangely, and my father became even more silent than usual. That day I decided to go to the local library. The place was old and quiet, as if time had stood still there. I knew that the librarian, Miss Grace, knew everything about our town and its surroundings. She was a small, elderly woman with neatly styled gray hair and glasses on a chain. If anyone could help me, it was her. I went up to the counter and, trying to look as carefree as possible, asked if she had anything about the surrounding area. She smiled and pulled out an old map that smelled of dust and time. "It has everything you need," she said, pointing to the map. I quickly ran my eyes over the places, but did not find anything similar to the cliffs. Then I decided to take a chance. I asked directly, "Have you ever heard of a place called the Cliffs?" Her gaze changed. She frowned and replied, "Oh, you must mean the old campsite at Hartman Lake. They called it the Cliffs because of the rocks that jutted out of the water. But the place has been abandoned for about 30 years. Why are you asking?" I lied and said I'd read about it in a book. She just shrugged and added, It's a beautiful place, but they say strange things have happened there. That was the clue I needed. I asked her for the address of the old campsite and headed home, making a plan in my head. I knew my parents wouldn't let me go there alone, so I decided to go with Ben. He was always up for an adventure, even if it seemed a little crazy. The next day, Ben and I got ready early in the morning. I had an old backpack with sandwiches and a flashlight. Ben brought his compass, which almost never worked, but looked impressive. We told our parents we were going to the park for a bike ride, and we set off. The camp was about 10 miles from our town. The road there was long, but we were eager to see this place with our own eyes. When we finally reached Lake Hartman, I immediately understood why it was called the Cliffs. The cliffs, high and steep, were reflected in the calm water, creating the illusion of something ancient and majestic. The camp that Miss Grace had spoken of was completely abandoned. The wooden houses had fallen apart, the paths were overgrown with grass, and the old pier had almost collapsed into the water. We walked around, studying the place. It was beautiful and a little sad at the same time, like an old photograph that holds too many memories. I imagined how my father and Helen could have spent time here. They probably sat by the fire or swam in this very lake. It seemed to me that I could feel their presence, as if the past had come to life around us. But the most unexpected thing happened when we came across another wooden box. It lay under an old pine tree, half buried in the ground. Ben and I pulled it out and opened it. Inside was a metal box, and in the box were more letters. But these letters were different from the ones I'd found in the barn. They were written to my father. In them, Helen begged him to come back. She wrote that she was still waiting for him at the cliffs, that they could start over. These letters made me realize that their story hadn't ended the way I thought. They hadn't split up by mutual consent. Her father had simply disappeared from her life, leaving her alone. But why? What had made him give up on this love? I couldn't think about it for long. Ben called me over to look at something he'd found nearby. It was a stone with the words George plus Helen carved into it. Underneath was the date, 1952. This place had been important to them, and now it had become important to me. I hardly spoke on the way home. Ben noticed my mood, but he didn't ask why I was grateful to him. I knew that now I had to go home and talk to my father. This secret was already too deeply rooted in my mind. I couldn't live without knowing the truth. That night I sat in my room for a long time, looking at the letters. There were too many questions in my head. Why did my father leave Helen? Did he know that she wrote to him even after they broke up? Why did he never tell me about his life before our family? The questions remained unanswered. I stared at the article in the old newspaper I found in the library for a long time. The name Helen Rivers stood out clearly from the other words. The article said that she had opened an art gallery in a small town in Ohio. This name, this place. It all seemed like part of the puzzle that I had been trying to solve for weeks. I did not immediately tell my father about my discovery. Instead, I spent a few more days thinking, pondering what to do next. Doubts gnawed at me. What if this woman does not want to remember the past? What if this story ended long before I came along? But one thought did not give me peace. Sometimes the answers lie in places where we are afraid to look. Since I learned about the cliffs, something in the house had changed. The tension that had been hanging in the air had become slightly less noticeable. My father seemed to have softened. He still spent a lot of time in the garage, but his movements were no longer as heavy as before. It seemed that he, too, was pondering something important. One day, alone at home, I took out the letters I had found again. They smelled of old paper and something vaguely familiar, as if each of them held a piece of those days that my father never wanted to remember. I couldn't stop thinking about one of them, the one where Helen mentioned the stars they had seen together at the cliffs. She wrote that the stars reminded her that life goes on, even when it seems like everything is lost. At that moment, I knew I had to tell my father about the gallery, not so he could face the past again, but so he could let go of what had held him back all these years. My father's reaction was unexpected. He sat in silence for a long time, looking at the newspaper clipping I had placed in front of him. His hands were shaking slightly, and I realized that this moment meant more to him than I could have imagined. But instead of tucking the newspaper away in a drawer, as he did with other reminders of the past, he folded it and put it in the breast pocket of his shirt. A few days later, he said he wanted to go. He didn't say why, and I didn't ask. It was his decision, but I knew I needed to be there. We loaded a few things into the car and hit the road. Ohio wasn't that far away, but the road seemed endless. I felt like the invisible wall he had been building for years was slowly disappearing between us. Along the way, my father finally began to talk about his youth. His words sounded unusually frank, as if he were trying to recapture moments he had buried. He remembered the cliffs, a place where he felt free, a place that reminded him that life could be more than the small-town routine. Helen, he said, was part of that feeling, a symbol of a time when everything seemed possible. When we arrived in the city where the gallery was located, I noticed how his gaze had changed. There was no longer the heaviness in his eyes that had haunted him at home. It was as if he had found something he had been searching for years. We parked in front of a small building with brightly colored windows that revealed paintings. My father did not immediately get out of the car. He sat looking at the entrance, and I could feel how he was living this moment. It seemed that two forces were fighting within him: the desire to return to the past and the fear of seeing how everything had changed. Finally, he gathered his courage and went inside. I waited in the car, deciding that this had to be his moment, his journey. As I sat there, looking at the people on the street, my thoughts returned to the photograph that had started it all. I suddenly realized that it wasn't just part of someone else's story, it had become part of mine. I had been trying to find answers for him all this time, but now I realized that I had changed in the process. When my father returned, he didn't say a word. He was holding a small painting. It was a landscape with a lake and cliffs. I recognized the place immediately, the cliffs. But there was more to the painting. In the foreground stood two figures, a boy and a girl, looking up at the starry sky. I realized that it was them, my father and Helen. On the way home, he put the painting on the back seat, but I noticed how he looked at it in the mirror from time to time. He didn't need to tell me anymore. Everything he felt, everything he wanted to say, was already on that canvas. When we got back, my father hung the painting in the garage, right above his work desk. From then on, he often sat there looking at it, but now his gaze was different. It was the gaze of a man who had found the answer to a question that had been bothering him for many years. For me, this trip was not only a journey into his past, but also into my own. I realized that life is not only what we build, but also what we preserve. And sometimes the most important thing is to remember that the stars, like memories, remain with us even when we think they are gone.